Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better.
As a practical matter every day, we all assume that we encounter other people and that these relationships are important. What should they be like in order to be as valuable, as meaningful, as satisfying, as possible? Hi, I'm an avatar for Dr. Dennis Bradford. He's a philosopher, which just means that he's serious about living wisely or well. It's helpful to consider the dynamics of power exchanges when wondering about committed friendships and love affairs. Let's use Dom to refer to the dominant one, the one with the most power, in the relationship, and let's use Sub to refer to the submissive one in the relationship. What's the source of the power imbalance in an encounter? It's an interesting and important fact that the Sub has more attachment to the relationship than the Dom. In other words, the Sub is more invested or self-interested in it than the Dom. That's the way life works. The less attachment, the more power. The way to wisdom, the way to living well, is the way of non-attachment. Successful philosophers, sages, have been teaching this for thousands of years. For simplicity of exposition, let's assume that the Dom is male and the Sub is female. That's the usual pattern, although it could be vice versa, or both could be male, or both could be female. What should the Dom's purpose be in the relationship? After all, he has more power and so more responsibility. His purpose should be to encourage and challenge the Sub to live better. Many people have the mistaken idea that the Dom's purpose is to use the Sub for his own selfish purposes. Nope. That's mere selfishness. It's taking, not giving. It's using, not loving. It's immoral, not moral. A power imbalance is not a value imbalance. Essentially and potentially, every human being is a sage. Every one of us can live wisely or well. In that sense, we are all equally valuable from a moral standpoint. That's why it's always immoral to treat others as nothing but means to our own selfish ends. It's true that we are all unique, that our form identities are all different. It's also true that, essentially, we're all the same as capital B being. In essence, we are all free and infinitely valuable. Even though it's not that way in everyday life, it should be. That's why it's critical that the Sub's attachment to her Dom be voluntary. If she should ever decide that the relationship is not in her best interest, she should end it. Involuntary service is nothing but slavery, which is immoral. The Dom's attachment to his Sub is also voluntary. What's its purpose? It's for him to bring out the best in her. How? How is the best in any human being uncovered? Sages, successful philosophers, have been teaching us how for literally thousands of years. It's an important insight to realize that wisdom is our birthright. We already have everything required to live well. The problem is that we don't realize it. Why don't we realize it? It's because we are compulsively thinking. We get stuck in our thoughts. Beliefs are just thoughts we think are true. Beliefs are the core of emotions. The resulting web of thoughts, beliefs, and emotions screens us from reality and creates persistent dissatisfaction or discontent. We look for lasting satisfaction where it cannot be found. In reality, abiding peacefulness, love, creativity, beauty, and bliss are available to each of us. The way to wisdom is the way of non-attachment to compulsive thoughting. How should the Dom uncover the best in his Sub? By encouraging and challenging her to break her addiction to compulsive thoughting. That's the justification for Sub training. Contrary to popular belief, it has nothing to do with sex and everything to do with freedom. The Dom's goal should be to help his Sub awaken from addiction to compulsive thoughting. Please don't misunderstand. There's nothing wrong with thinking. Our ability to think is a valuable human asset. The problem results from addiction to thinking, from trying to live life in our thoughts rather than in our lives. It's that addiction that needs to be broken to be able to live well. Fostering that awakening is the purpose of Sub training. It may help to think of it as opening becoming to being. Every act is an opportunity to awaken out of thought addiction. Of course, every act is also an opportunity for continued thought addiction. Living well requires getting the how right. Strictly speaking, to know something is to have demonstrative or certain evidence that it's true. Because all the consequences of an act are relevant to its moral evaluation, and because it's impossible to know all the consequences of an act in advance, it's impossible to know the rightness or wrongness of an act. If so, acts are always like shots into the dark that may or may not hit their target. Those who are mature realize this. We're responsible for what we do or don't do without knowing all the consequences of our actions or inactions. On the other hand, even though it's impossible to know whether the whatness of an act is right or wrong, it's possible to get how an act is performed correct. An act is performed correctly when it is performed egolessly with no thought. So, the best we're able to do is, in one way of putting it, to act from being rather than from becoming. All thoughts are egocentric. They are all relative to a personal perspective. Therefore, All actions performed from thinking are egocentric. By way of contrast, all actions performed without thinking, from no thought, are non-egocentric. Such acts are usually called awakened or enlightened. The more our actions come from no thought, the more we are living well. That's how sages live. That's wisdom. An analogy would be to a master athlete who is performing with no thought. When an athlete is thinking about what to do, that is not being in the zone. So, the ultimate purpose of sub-training is to have the sub practice living more like a sage, in other words, to have the sub live with no thought. One way to put this is to claim that it's to have the sub live in becoming from the perspective of being. Sages think only when thinking is beneficial, otherwise, unlike non-sages, they are free from the tyranny of useless thoughts. That should be the ideal for all of us, doms and subs alike. A sub is a voluntary submissive who wants to serve her dom-dominant master, often sexually and domestically. The more each of her acts is free from useless thoughts, the more successful her training has been. Her submission is based on consent, which she freely gives because she wants to be loved and to live better. Ultimately, the sub, not the dom, is in control of the relationship. If she's not being loved well, if the quality of her life is not improving as a result of her training, she's free to end the encounter with her dom. A wise dom, therefore, should love his sub to the best of his ability. Since love is a state of being, the dom is responsible for his own freedom from attachment to useless thoughts. When he acts towards his sub from that perspective, his acts will benefit his sub as opposed to acting so that he gets her to benefit him. The relationship between the dom and the sub is, or should be, based on love. It's the dom's duty to love her as skillfully as possible, to promote what is best for her. Essentially, the dom's task is to hold space for the sub, to guide and protect her, to enable her to become more herself by detaching from the tyranny of useless thoughts. Loving is giving, it's not taking. The dom's chief task is to love the sub. He benefits when he succeeds in helping his sub live better. This sets the proper context for sub training. What's its content? How should it actually work in practice? It's helpful to distinguish two different levels of experience. The first level is related to pain and pleasure, which are products of the body's nervous system. Pain and pleasure can be intensified by occurring together. The end is orgasm. Most doms understand this and concentrate on giving the sub the quantity and quality of orgasms she desires. This is often achieved by increasing frustration and delaying the sub's gratification. The second level is beyond pain, pleasure, and all other sensations and concepts. It requires ego reduction and, therefore, the sub's sustained cooperation and effort. It's no thought. The end is ecstasy samadhi, the opening of becoming to being. Even few unselfish doms understand this, much less focus on it. From the dom's perspective, he should focus on both levels. From the sub's perspective, she should understand that being submissive is not being passive. It is the sub's duty to communicate with her dom. If one of the two levels is more important to her, she should communicate that to her dom. The more intelligent, self-aware, articulate, and honest she is, the more effective the communication will be. The higher her self-esteem, the more effective the training may be. Low self-esteem obstructs the way of non-attachment. She ought to communicate to her dom her predominant learning style, her personality type, and her primary and secondary love languages in order to enhance communication, as well as her sexual experiences and sexual preferences. It's the sub's duty to communicate all hard and soft limits to her dom, and it's his duty to respect them, even if he occasionally stretches her soft limits. It is the sub's duty to learn the difference between sensation and sensitivity and to free herself from craving more sensation. Why? While some sensation is good, more sensation is not better. More and more sensation correlates to less and less sensitivity, whereas less and less sensation correlates to more sensitivity. The idea is to use what is natural to transcend it. If sex is made into a means for something else, it becomes less satisfying. It quickly degenerates into lovers merely using each other, often mechanically, to achieve orgasm. Instead, if it has no end beyond itself, it opens up the fullness of the present moment beyond thought into genuine interconnectedness or unity. Like any other act, sex can be an opening to being. The idea is being love as opposed, say, to being in love. The emotional roller coaster is to be abandoned in favor of abiding bliss. Since emotions cannot exist without egocentric thoughts, the greater the detachment from thoughts, the more the bliss of being occurs. It's the dom's duty to use everything he has learned about the sub to bring out the best in her. He is a father or daddy figure guiding and disciplining his girl in a loving way. A perfect dom would be self-disciplined, experienced, selfless, trustworthy, sensitive, strong, attentive, fun, caring, consistent, empathetic, compassionate, intelligent, confident, fearless, assertive, well-educated, and financially secure. He should be able to train the sub using rewards and punishments, including structured humiliation and objectification if agreed to become all she is able to be. A dom is a leader who protects his sub and keeps her safe and in the best possible physical and emotional health while she is in the process of becoming all she is able to become by diminishing her attachment to her ego. It's helpful to think of a dom-sub relationship as similar to dancing. His focus should be on how his sub is feeling and not on how he is feeling. Being a good sub and being a good dom are learning experiences, and the learning never stops. The interplay begins with consent and communication. The play between the sub and her dom occurs. It's followed by aftercare and debriefing. The point of the debriefing is to articulate lessons learned. Since nothing in becoming abides, even though formal dom-sub training will end after a certain number of days or weeks, partners may continue practicing dominance and submission as a way of life indefinitely. Peace.